Picture this. It's 1944, somewhere in rural Mississippi, and a German soldier who just months ago was fighting American troops in the African desert is now picking cotton on an American farm, earning 80 cents a day and eating better than he ever did back home. Sounds strange? Most Americans today have absolutely no idea this even happened. Between 1942 and 1946, the United States held nearly 500,000 enemy prisoners of war on its own soil, not in concentration camps or gulags, but in 700 camps spread across the American heartland. The Associated Press would later call it an all but forgotten part of history, and honestly, that's putting it mildly. By the end of World War II, 175 main camps and 511 branch camps held over 425,000 prisoners, most of them German. November 1944 saw over 280,000 German prisoners distributed across 132 base camps and 334 branch camps, and by April 1945 the number jumped to over 340,000. These camps were everywhere. Eventually every state except Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont had at least one, and Hawaii too. The South hosted most of them, because heating barracks in Minnesota winters would have cost a fortune, and the government wanted to minimize construction costs while keeping prisoners away from urban industrial areas for security purposes. Mississippi alone operated 4 major base camps. Nebraska held about 12,000 prisoners, while Virginia housed an estimated 17,000 German soldiers, and Colorado ran 48 POW camps between 1943 and 1946. But here's what makes this story absolutely remarkable. These weren't death camps or even particularly harsh detention centers. They were run in strict accordance with the 1929 Geneva Convention, and in many cases the prisoners lived better than they had as soldiers in the field. Enemy soldiers, captured on the battlefield, living better as prisoners in America than they had fighting for Germany. The first prisoners were actually Italian, captured mostly in North Africa in 1942, but the Real Flood started in May 1943 when the Afrika Korps was defeated. That's where most of the German POWs came from, and they arrived through the port of New York or Virginia's port of Hampton Roads, usually packed into Liberty ships heading back from Europe that would otherwise be empty. As many as 30,000 arrived per month, and yeah, they risked being sunk by their own U-boats during the crossing, but once they were aboard, good treatment began immediately with substantial meals served on the ships. When they arrived in America, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. The comfort of the Pullman train cars that took them to the camps, the size of the country, the prosperity everywhere. Remember, these men were coming from a Europe that had been bombed and burned and starved for years, and America must have looked like another planet. The Geneva Convention required the United States to provide living quarters comparable to its own military, which meant 40 square feet for enlisted men. If prisoners had to sleep in tents while their permanent quarters were being built, guess what? Their guards did too. Camp designers built facilities to hold 3,000 prisoners each, divided into compounds of 1,000 men, and each compound had 5 barracks holding 50 men each plus a mess hall, latrine, and administration building. All prisoners ate the same rations as American soldiers because the Geneva Convention required it, which included wine for general officers and special meals for Thanksgiving and Christmas, and the German POWs found the quality of food superior to anything they'd had in the field. One POW wrote that when he was captured he weighed 128 pounds, but after 2 years, as an American POW, he weighed 185, and had gotten so fat you could no longer see his eyes. Think about that for a second. Many of these prisoners found that living conditions as POWs were better than their civilian lives back in Germany, better than the cold water apartments they'd grown up in. Now, things did change after the war ended when in May 1945 the office of the Provost Marshal General limited available food and ended canteen food sales. Why? American civilians had complained that prisoners were eating too well, and since the Geneva Convention technically no longer applied after Germany surrendered, prisoners' rations were cut and workloads increased. Not all prisoners were treated equally. The 3 admirals and 40 generals in American custody were sent to Camp Clinton and Camp Shelby in Mississippi, where each one got his own bungalow with a garden, and among them were some genuinely famous figures. Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, who commanded all Axis forces in North Africa after Rommel left, was there. Dietrich von Koltitz, the last wartime governor of Paris, who became famous for surrendering the city to the Free French rather than burning it like Hitler ordered, was there too. General von Arnim lived in a house, and was given a car and driver, and some people even swore they saw him at the movies in Jackson, Mississippi, because the theater was the only air-conditioned place in town. This extraordinarily comfortable treatment was strategic. The U.S. wanted these men cooperative, especially since many held valuable intelligence about German military operations. But there was another side to this story, one that wouldn't be revealed until the early 2000s. Behind an iron fence and razor wire at Fort Hunt, Virginia, formerly part of George Washington's farmlands, 3,451 German prisoners were interrogated between 1942 and 1945. This top-secret facility was known only as P.O. Box 1142, and between 1942 and 1946 military interrogators questioned more than 3,400 prisoners, over 500 of whom were scientists brought to the U.S. as part of Operation Paperclip. Notable prisoners included Wernher von Braun, the rocket scientist who would later help America reach the moon, Reinhard Gehlen, spymaster and head of all intelligence on the Eastern Front, and Heinz Schlick, inventor of infrared detection. The interrogation methods at Fort Hunt were sophisticated and, notably, nonviolent, with many interrogators being Jewish immigrants who had fled Germany as children and were chosen specifically because they understood German language and culture inside and out. National Park Service Ranger Brandon Bees later interviewed over 70 former interrogators, and they all insisted they did not use physical torture, only psychological tricks. They used stool pigeons, plants who pretended to be other prisoners, made friends with the real prisoners, threatened to turn them over to the Russians, and hid microphones everywhere, even in the trees, because prisoners would talk out in the open air thinking they were safe. German prisoners spent their days playing soccer and watching movies, while those microphones captured everything. One former interrogator recalled that they would give prisoners whatever they wanted just to get them to talk, furnishing liquor, and even getting them women. In 1946, all 100 barracks at Fort Hunt were bulldozed, and the existence of the facility wasn't revealed to the public until the early 2000s. October 2007 brought together a group of former intelligence workers for the first time since the war ended, and in 2001 German historian Sonk Neitzel found about 150,000 pages of interrogation reports and bugged room conversations from Fort Hunt. There was one notable security breach. German U-boat commander Werner Henke was fatally shot when he tried to escape by climbing the fence. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could work on farms or elsewhere, but only if they were paid, and officers could not be forced to work. The prisoners couldn't be used in work directly related to the military or in dangerous conditions, and the minimum pay for enlisted soldiers was 80 cents per day, equivalent to about $15 in today's money and roughly the same as what an American private earned. The money could be used at the camp store or put in a trust fund available after the war. For context, wages for farm laborers in the U.S. averaged about $2.82 per day by January 1946, which meant the prisoners earned less than American workers, but they were still earning something. As the war went on, farms and factories across America struggled with massive labor shortages, and German POWs helped out in canneries, mills, farms, and other places deemed minimal security risks. A typical day might start at 7:30 in the morning working at fruit orchards, while in the Mississippi Delta prisoners grew and harvested cotton, and in the Piney Woods region they worked lumber and pulpwood. The demand was so high that as late as February 1945 politicians in rural states were asking the government for 100,000 more prisoners to work on farms. Perhaps the most impressive work done by German POWs was the Mississippi River Basin model, and their contribution, valued at several $1 million, allowed the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to proceed with this massive flood control project. In the decades after completion, data from the model helped save billions of dollars in property damage from flooding. Given the massive number of prisoners and the relatively relaxed conditions, you'd think escapes would be common, but they weren't. Of the tens of thousands of POWs in the United States during World War II, only 2,222 tried to escape, less than 1%, and most were recaptured within a day. When repatriation came, the U.S. government could account for all but 7 prisoners. Why so few guards? There weren't enough American soldiers, especially ones who spoke German, which meant they mostly supervised the German officers and NCOs who maintained strict discipline among their own men. In other words, the Germans were largely policing themselves. The most famous escape was George Gardner, who escaped from a POW camp in Deming, New Mexico, on September 21, 1945, because he didn't want to be sent back to Silesia, which was occupied by the Soviet Union. He assumed a new identity as Dennis Wiles and lived quietly in California, Colorado, and Hawaii before coming forward in 1985, 40 years later. Why were escape attempts so rare? Part of it was geography, because where were they going to go? And part of it was treatment, since they were being fed well and treated humanely. But a big part was fear. Fear of being captured by the Soviets, since more than 1 million German POWs died in Soviet captivity, and approximately 3 million Germans were held by the USSR. By comparison, staying in America didn't look so bad. One of the most surprising parts of this story is how German prisoners and American civilians actually got along. Prisoners picked cotton and peaches, rolled cigarettes and cut timber, sometimes coming into close contact with locals, and the interactions were often friendly. Kelly Holthus, 76, of York, Nebraska, recalled years later having the impression the prisoners were happy to be out of the war. Paul Roller recounted in 2001 that he arranged to get 4 men with no guards, and his responsibilities were to pick them up at 8 a.m. and take care of them through the day, and get them back at camp by 4 p.m. After a day spent cutting corn, Roller and his wife provided dinner for the 4 young men. One family even invited German POWs to share Christmas dinner, and by the end of the night, the enemy soldiers were gathered around the piano singing Christmas carols, while the family listened and sang along. Unauthorized fraternization between American women and German prisoners was sometimes a problem, though several camps held social receptions with local American girls, and some Germans even met their future wives as prisoners. Why were Americans so willing to be friendly with enemy soldiers? A November 1943 poll found that 74% of Americans blamed the German government for the war, not Germans themselves, and that distinction mattered. These weren't viewed as Nazis necessarily, but as soldiers caught up in something bigger than themselves. The American government didn't just want to house these prisoners, but wanted to change them. Fort Eustis, now Joint Base Eustis Langley in Newport News, hosted a re-education center where there was an effort to denazify POWs, and the program gave 26,000 Germans a 6-day course in democracy. The course was broken down into 12 topics, and there was hope that those who completed it would apply what they learned to German government and culture once they went home, becoming a weapon in the next war, the Cold War with Russia. Before being sent home, prisoners were required to watch documentaries of the Nazi concentration camps, and the re-education could also include English classes and exposure to anti-Japanese propaganda. Particularly popular among POWs were works by anti-Nazi refugee writers like Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, Thomas Mann's Zauberberg, and Franz Werfel's The Song of Bernadette. Camps had subscriptions to American newspapers, and every camp published its own newspaper with poetry, short stories, puzzles, upcoming events, and classified ads. Although they expected to go home right after the war ended in 1945, most German prisoners continued working in the United States until 1946 because of the ongoing war with Japan and continued civilian labor shortages, which meant the prisoners couldn't be released quickly. Early 1946 saw the United States repatriate all the POWs in its camps, but some 130,000 were British-owned prisoners and were delivered to Liverpool instead of Germany. The United States transferred 740,000 German prisoners to Europe for forced labor, and most German POWs of the Americans and British were released by the end of 1948, though the majority then spent up to 3 more years as laborers in France and the United Kingdom. For comparison, around 200,000 German POWs were in Britain when Germany surrendered in May 1945, and that peaked at around 400,000 in 1946. The final POWs weren't returned to Germany until July 1948. After repatriation, about 5,000 Germans immigrated to the United States, while thousands of others returned later to visit. Rüdiger von Wechmer lived in New York City for 14 years as the German permanent representative to the United Nations. The testimonials from former prisoners are striking. Alex Funk, who served as military chaplain to fellow POWs at Camp Algona, wrote that they all were positively impressed by the U.S. and that they all had been won over to friendly relations with America. Citing 80 fellow prisoners he corresponded with after returning home, Funk reported that no re-education had been necessary in the camps because they had become convinced Democrats due to their treatment. These men weren't converted by propaganda or force, but were converted by example, by being treated humanely, by seeing democracy function in practice, and by experiencing a society that had abundance without authoritarianism. About 860 German POWs remain buried in 43 sites across the United States, and their graves are often tended by local German women's clubs. When we think about World War II, we think about battlefields and bombing raids, concentration camps and combat, but we don't often think about 425,000 enemy soldiers living in American towns, working American farms, eating American food, and slowly becoming convinced that maybe they'd been on the wrong side. The American POW program wasn't perfect. There were legitimate complaints about prisoners eating too well while American families dealt with rationing, and the decision to keep prisoners working after the war ended violated the spirit, if not the letter, of the Geneva Convention. The contrast with how American POWs were treated in Germany and Japan is stark, or how German POWs were treated by the Soviets, since official statistics placed the number of American POWs in Germany at 92,965, and they endured harsher conditions than Germans held in the United States, chiefly because Germany lacked resources at the close of the war. But what happened here was genuinely unusual in the history of warfare. A country brought hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers to its own soil, fed them well, paid them for their work, treated them humanely, and sent many of them home as reluctant admirers of the nation they'd been trying to destroy. The camps in the United States remain what the Associated Press called an all but forgotten part of history, even though some former inmates went on to become prominent in post-war Germany. Maybe that's because the story doesn't fit neatly into our narratives about good and evil, heroes and villains. but is instead about what happens when you treat people with basic dignity, even when they're supposed to be your enemy. For those 425,000 German soldiers, America wasn't what they expected, and for many of them, that unexpected experience changed everything.